Okay, let me start by just saying a little bit about my background in China, the time that I've spent in China in the past and quite recently. Here's a picture that I like to share from my very first trip to China back in 1982. I had more hair then. As a matter of fact, I also want to give a shout out to my parents, who I believe I saw in the audience earlier. That's Charles and Helen Reed. They are people very much like many of you, I think. They live in Madison, Wisconsin. And I would not be giving this talk if they had not accepted an invitation to spend a year teaching in China back in the early 1980s. So our family of four went to Beijing, and my sister and I spent a year in local school in Beijing, learning Chinese on a kind of a sink or swim basis. And China back then, this is an obvious point, but bears explaining a bit, was a very different place from the China of today. Here's a picture from Beijing in the mid 80s, and you can see that people did not have private cars, for example, back then. And the place was relatively drab. China had only recently emerged from the Mao era and the Cultural Revolution. The clothing that people wore was very basic and not particularly colorful. And China was a far cry from what it is today in terms of its sort of overall development and affluence. Later, I went back to China and lived there for 2 years after college. And still later, I went and spent a year and a half in China doing my dissertation research. And here's a picture from those years. I'm sitting here with members of one of Beijing's official neighborhood committees. I did a lot of my dissertation research on essentially an ethnographic basis, hanging out in the offices of these state neighborhood committees, which provide all kinds of services to the population, from welfare to various kinds of family planning, while also sort of keeping an eye on the people of the city in all kinds of ways. And that's what my dissertation and first book was about. We'll come back to these neighborhood committees later in my talk. And then most recently, to fast forward to last year, I spent the fall in Shanghai, based at Fudan University, one of China's top universities. I was serving as the faculty director for China for the UC Education Abroad program, which is, as you probably know, the unified study abroad program that serves all of the UC campuses. So I was in charge of some UC students in Shanghai, also UC students in Beijing. And of course, the education abroad programs in China were cut short by the coronavirus. So they were, and my tenure as faculty director was abruptly cut short as well. We do not have any exchange students in China right now. But nonetheless, this was a fantastic experience, and I really enjoyed working with UC students as well as our counterparts in China. And it gave me a chance to kind of update a lot of my understanding of China, since a lot of my recent research has been in Taiwan rather than in mainland China. And here we have some of the students that took my class in Shanghai. We weren't. It was a little bit of a gray area whether we were supposed to actually drink beer with the students, but once in a while after a field trip, it seemed entirely justified. We got out and saw different parts of the city. We visited museums and so forth. And the UC students were really a great group of kids to teach there. Okay, enough about me. Let me set the stage for what I'm going to talk about today. Here we have a picture of President Xi Jinping almost 1 year ago at the immense ceremony commemorating the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And I was in Shanghai at the time. As you might recall from the news reports about this, the entire city of Beijing was essentially on lockdown in the run-up to this big parade. So just about everybody, including me and UC students, watched this on TV. So we watched a parade of tanks and missiles and soldiers go by, and then there was a civilian parade of floats representing various concepts and places from around China. So China was putting on display so many of the things that it takes as emblematic of the People's Republic of China. Its military prowess, its national unity, as well as continuity with the past. So among the floats in the parade were celebrations of former leaders prior to Xi Jinping. There was one float that even paid homage to the heavy, clunky bicycles that were prevalent in the 1980s when I first lived in China. But above all, the ceremony put the spotlight on Xi Jinping himself. He is now, as of this year, 67 years old. He's been the leader of the Chinese Communist Party for 8 years. And in many ways, he's put his own distinctive stamp on China, even if in other respects he represents a continuation of trends that were already underway before his arrival. Let me put China and its communist regime in perspective here. One way to think about China is to compare it with other states that are ruled by communist parties. There have been 15 such regimes. And if we look at this chart here, we see that the PRC has not quite surpassed, in terms of its duration, the original communist regime in the Soviet Union, which it once copied in so many respects. As you recall, in the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, after the collapse of the USSR and 9 other communist regimes, it was widely expected that China's Communist Party would follow a similar path and collapse in due course. And that's very much not how things have turned out, at least not so far. If we look at the bottom of the graph here, each of the 5 remaining communist regimes is quite distinct. So North Korea and Vietnam and Cuba, let's say, all have things in common with the People's Republic of China, and yet they're all very different in ways that I won't necessarily go into. China doesn't stand out so much for being long-lived as a communist regime goes. But as for the ways it has grown and adapted to the modern world, even while maintaining the firm grip of the party's rule. And it's a system that is built around very different institutions and traditions relative to the United States. Because it is not going away and its power and influence are rising, it is something that I find endlessly fascinating and important, really, to teach my students at UC about, and I think it behooves us all to understand it as well as we can. So my goals for this talk are, I'm going to explain some of the major reasons for the resilience of Communist Party rule in China, drawing on research by a number of scholars of Chinese politics. I taught a graduate seminar on Chinese Communist Party politics last spring, and this word resilience is inescapable in the literature on China these days. It's what everyone is trying to understand and explain. I'm also going to illustrate what I'm talking about with some images, some glimpses of everyday life in China, especially from my recent stay there. And I'm going to try to parse out what is distinctive of Xi Jinping's rule, as opposed to things that we can attribute to broader trends, longer term trends in China. And I promise not to have too many slides that are based around bullet points, but let me give you one more here. This is going to be my outline for today. I'm going to talk about 5 factors that underpin the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party. I've listed them there. And with those in mind, I'll just briefly touch on some recent topics that have been in the news. COVID-19, Xinjiang, and what's going on with the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. There are, of course, many other things that we could talk about as well. So my lecture is not going to talk about the situation with US and China right now, but of course, you may have questions about that, and we can go into that in the Q&A. Okay, so turning to the first point that I want to make about the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party, we have to explain that in part by the relatively stable leadership situation that we've had within the Communist Party in recent years. Here we see Xi Jinping chairing a meeting of the Politburo. The Politburo is the body that sits at the very top of the Chinese Communist Party. It's rare to see pictures. They don't usually release pictures of their meetings. And we could endlessly discuss sort of what China means us to take from this picture. We see Xi Jinping sort of among his colleagues and yet alone in his supreme authority. They're all sort of dressed in a relatively casual way with short sleeve shirts, and they're obviously getting down to business and talking about something very important here. So it's rare that we see directly into the inner workings of bodies like the Politburo, but this is something of what it looks like. Stepping back and thinking about the leaders who have ruled China since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Leadership transitions have often posed a problem in communist and other authoritarian systems, and they have done so in the past in China and may again in the future. When Mao died in 1976, there was a struggle for power. Mao's appointed successor, Hua Guofeng, I haven't even pictured here because he only lasted 2 years when he was abruptly shunted aside by Deng Xiaoping, who took power and instituted broad reforms that really brought us close to the China of today, put China on a radically different path. There was, of course, a great crisis in 1989 with popular protests calling for democracy and so forth. These were suppressed by the military, and this was happening in part because of a split among the leadership that was resolved by the hardliners taking power, and Jiang Zemin was then installed in the course of this leadership crisis. People didn't know how long Jiang would last as a leader, but in fact, he proved to be quite long-lived, survived the death of the man who appointed him, Deng Xiaoping, in 1997. And then the next two leadership transitions went relatively smoothly. So in 2002, power went to Hu Jintao. And then 10 years later, Hu Jintao stepped down and Xi Jinping began his term as the head of the party and then as the president of the state. So because these went so smoothly, it was believed that norms of regular leadership succession, even if only informal norms, had been established. So Hu Jintao's period in power suggested that henceforth, leaders would serve a very regular pattern of 2 5-year terms and then step down in favor of a successor chosen by some kind of consensus within the leadership and groomed for power over the course of years. But under Xi Jinping, contrary to previous practice, no evident successors were elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee at the last party Congress in 2017. In early 2018, the PRC constitution was amended to abolish the 2-term limit for the state president. And so now once more, we're wondering whether we have returned to a situation as prevailed under Mao and arguably under Deng Xiaoping, where leaders might hold power for life. Has China set itself up for another power struggle when someday Xi Jinping leaves the stage? We don't know that. Xi Jinping is now well into his second 5-year term. And at the end of every party Congress, there's a moment when the new top leadership is brought out and presented to the world. This is the Politburo Standing Committee, the sort of elite among the elite of the elite, the subset of the Politburo that has the very most power. In the United States here, we have gender reveal parties. China has leadership reveal parties, or ceremonies, you might say, at the end of these party congresses, and in China, it's always a boy. There's never been a woman on the Politburo Standing Committee. The party congress in 2017 gave Xi Jinping a chance to bring a number of personal loyalists into top positions of authority. But the men around him there are not just Xi Jinping's cronies. Some of them are that, but these are people with substantial accomplishment and capability. And I won't talk about all of them, but we'll look a little bit more at one of them later. Take a look at the second on the left there, a man named Wang Huning. We will come back to him presently. Okay, so under Xi, as I'm sure you've seen one way or another, we've seen a number of initiatives and themes of Xi Jinping's rule in the past 8 years. His grand theme has been what's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and relatedly, the pursuit of the China dream of strength and prosperity. Xi has, since immediately after coming into office, pursued an ongoing anti-corruption campaign and has purged tens of thousands of Communist Party officials at high levels of the party and also at local levels of the party, rooting out corruption and also ensuring his unquestioned rule. Xi has also, in terms of the ideas of Xi Jinping's rule, he has also promoted continuity with the Mao era and even insisted that the party continue to pay respect to the ideas of Marx, even though Communist Party today has departed from Marxian ideology in so many ways. Nonetheless, rhetorically at least, Mao and Marx are still considered essential reference in the Communist Party discourse. Xi Jinping's absolute leadership of the party has been a key theme of the past 8 years. He has, for instance, established himself as the chair of a number of leading committees within the party that exercise control over policy in areas of foreign affairs and Hong Kong and Taiwan and so forth. And indeed, just as Xi is the absolute leader of the party, so Xi Jinping has emphasized the party's, quote, leadership over everything. So the party has tightened its control over the media, over schools, over the arts, and so forth. We've also seen initiatives like the vast Belt and Road Project, an immense program where China funds and builds transportation infrastructure, ports and railroads throughout Eurasia and Africa. And Xi Jinping has presided over China's rise to seeing itself as a great power in the world. In one of the catchier slogans of the Xi era, China is completing a historical process where under Mao, China stood up and established the People's Republic of China. Under Deng Xiaoping, it began to get rich. And now under Xi Jinping, it is getting strong. Accordingly, Xi Jinping has emphasized ideas like that China must practice the 4 self-confidences. And a friend of mine who works for the state broadcaster explained that in the past, the state news would emphasize ways in which, China was sort of catching up to the rest of the world, was making progress in reaching a state of advanced technology or governance or what have you. Under Xi, that's not supposed to be the theme anymore. China is no longer catching up. It has arrived, and it needs to project that kind of confidence in many respects. So all told, Xi Jinping is, for those of us who study Chinese politics, we've had to reconsider what we thought we knew about Chinese politics in the post-Mao era. We've had to rewrite our lectures. We thought that when we looked at the progression from Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, that we saw a movement away from charismatic leadership towards technocracy. And yet now we've had a movement back towards a personality cult and charisma under Xi. We thought that China had learned the lesson of giving one man too much power under Mao Zedong, and that therefore the individual leadership had given way towards a broader collective leadership under the Politburo Standing Committee. But now we've seen a movement back towards one-man rule under Xi Jinping. We thought that the party had moved towards greater institutionalization, that it was bound by rules and norms. And yet, as we've seen, Xi has broken a number of norms and emphasizes that the party is not bound by the law, never has been and isn't moving in that direction. So all these things have enabled vigorous leadership under Xi Jinping, while also potentially making trouble within the party for the future, as we think about, for example, what would happen after Xi Jinping. So leadership stability is one reason for the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party. Let me turn to another one, and this is sort of already widely appreciated by just about everyone, and yet I want to sort of bring it to life with some images from what it looks like in Shanghai, and that is China's prosperity and development. You've probably seen charts of China's phenomenal economic growth. This is a little hard to read because the numbers are a little small, but this is taken directly from World Bank data, and it goes back to the early 1970s, showing China's annual rate of per capita growth. That's in the blue line here, and it's relative to, you can see a faint zero line there that runs through the middle of the chart. So China has regularly racked up growth rates of 8%, 10%, sometimes even more for much of the past 4 decades. And it compares favorably to, this growth record compares favorably to even other relatively well-performing countries that belong to the developing world, such as Brazil, for example. So these are numbers. What does this look like in practice? Well, to take some images from Shanghai. Shanghai is, of course, this historic city that prospered under foreign rule during the period when China was sort of a partially colonized by the West. We see legacies of that in some of the buildings in the foreground here in Shanghai. But thinking about the Shanghai of today, part of what people like to put on display or emphasize is the district of Pudong, which, as you can see from 1990, 3 decades ago, this was barely begun to be developed. We're looking at the far side of the river here, across the river from the historic Bund district. As of the year 2000, I took this rather fuzzy shot with an early digital camera. We see how the Pudong district was beginning to emerge with some huge skyscrapers and the curious Eastern Pearl Tower there with the funny red balls on it. And now, as of 2017 or today, this is what Pudong looks like. It is China's major financial center and has a number of enormous buildings in it, including the second highest building in the world, the Shanghai Tower there, which you can see on the right. And you can do a river tour at night, and all of these buildings are lit up with flashing lights, and it's all extremely grand. But to think about other things about sort of life in Shanghai and really in urban China more generally, today I spent an awful lot of time getting around Shanghai on one of its 18 subway lines, extremely convenient. And cities around China now have good subway transportation. And that is, some of the subway lines will take you to the Hongqiao high-speed rail station. Here's a picture that I took last fall, this vast high-speed rail station. From there, you can take a train like this to other parts of China. It's really a great way to get to even as far away as Beijing or nearby cities like Hangzhou. And China has, just in the past 15 years or so, built a massive network of high-speed rail, totaling some 22,000 miles as of the beginning of this year. The trains go at speeds of 155 to 217 miles per hour on them. This compares to Well, 0 miles of high-speed rail in the United States, and none happening anytime soon, even in California here. In terms of just ordinary life in China, we see that there are lots of things that are quite convenient. So this is the market down the street from where I lived in Shanghai. Shanghai used to have outdoor markets. This is like essentially a farmer's market that takes place every day. Now they've collected those into 2-story buildings, and I would go and buy my vegetables from this lady here. Or if you don't feel like cooking for yourself, there are lots of fantastic things to eat in Shanghai, and I told myself I would confine myself to a single picture of restaurant food that I ate there. And of course, this is a special meal and you know, a bit high end, although not an extravagant meal. Absolutely delicious. Even if we think about ordinary restaurants, the type that people would eat at on a more everyday basis, and I ate in a lot of those, there's an awful lot to enjoy in Shanghai and in cities more generally in China. So my point here is that China's rising wealth has made a tremendous difference for people's lives in the past 2 or 3 decades. Life in urban China these days is convenient and enjoyable in most respects. There are downsides, such as chronic air pollution, for example. But all told, this matters in how people think about the system they live in and how it compares to alternatives abroad. But wealth and development, although they're widely appreciated as part of China today, they're not the only reason for the party's resilience. There are others as well. Next, I'm going to talk about the way in which the Communist Party has harnessed national pride. This is an old theme in Chinese politics. The two are inextricable, the party and the nation. This is a trick that communist parties in places like East Germany or Hungary couldn't really pull off. So moments of national pride are thus always propaganda victories for the party. Here we see the ceremony at which Britain handed over control of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Another great moment of national pride was when Beijing first hosted the Olympic Games in 2008. I think we remember that. And China is on track to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. So we will have another similar moment of great national pride coming up. And one trend that's related to this, but a little bit different from recent decades that has deepened under Xi Jinping has been that China has reclaimed elements of its pre-revolutionary past as part of a broader narrative of historic grandeur evolving into present-day glory. The generation that founded the Communist Party back in 1921 firmly rejected the ideas of Confucius. They saw them as everything emblematic of everything that held China back and that oppressed young people in particular. But now Confucius is fully back in style. And you can see this if you get on a airliner of Shandong Airlines. So Shandong is, modern day Shandong is where Confucius was born more than 2,500 years ago. And the airline proudly embraces its connection to the great sage. So the message here, and there was one quote from Confucius for every row on the 747 above the window, on the 737 above the window there, is one that emphasizes the filial duty of children to their aging parents, one that I can relate to here. And perhaps you can too. So China has sort of embraced its past, its historic past, and this idea that what the Communist Party presides over today is actually not a rupture from the past, but is part of an unbroken strain of gradually rising sort of return to glory of the Chinese nation. Let me say a few words about the way in which the party has co-opted or marginalized various groups that potentially might push back against the Communist Party rule. So when I last checked, China had 338 billionaires denominated in US dollar terms. The very richest among them is this man, Jack Ma, or Ma Yun, of Alibaba, which is, he's a little bit like the Jeff Bezos of China. He is, apart from being a sort of celebrated entrepreneur, he is also a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and a very loud and proud and loyal one at that. When China's billionaires don't toe the line, bad things happen to them. We think of Ren Zhiqiang, who publicly criticized earlier this year Xi Jinping over the handling of the coronavirus, and was soon disappeared, and just recently has been put on trial for corruption. We also think of another billionaire named Xiao Jianhua, who was abducted from a hotel in Hong Kong in 2017. So China's sort of tycoons and oligarchs are very much on board with the party's program. Something that I've done research on in China is I studied neighborhoods and also housing in China. One of the things that I studied was the question of really whether, as more and more ordinary people in China came to own housing starting in the 1990s and later on, including in really very ordinary neighborhoods like the kind that we're looking at here in this picture of Yantai, a city in Shandong province. You know, these are the kinds of places where hundreds of millions of Chinese people live. And my question was whether, as people exercised ownership over these homes, whether they would start to insist on greater control, even just in their local communities, over how the neighborhood is run, for example. So I studied China's homeowner associations. And this was part of, you could say, a broader program in which many scholars have participated, of studying the middle class and wondering whether it would advocate for democracy and autonomy in one way or another. And to summarize a lot of this literature, the basic consensus is sort of that not necessarily. And so these homeowner organizations, just to give you one example, have been active. They continue to push for their rights against the property development companies, for instance, or the property management companies and so forth. And yet this has not aggregated to any sort of broader demand for power sharing or democracy, even at the very most local of levels. Finally, let me say a few words about China's intellectuals. When we visit China or we read the news, we often think about the very most liberal of China's intellectuals, people like Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in absentia in 2010, and later died in prison in China of cancer. Or we think more recently of people like Mr. Xu Zhangrun of Tsinghua University in Beijing, a professor who boldly criticized Xi Jinping in writing and essays that have been translated into English, who was detained this summer and has been kept under surveillance. So these people exist. These liberal intellectuals are there. They've been much studied by the outside world. They are indeed critical of the way things are going, now more than ever under Xi Jinping. But they are not in the majority, and they're definitely on the defensive these days. During my time at Fudan University, here we're looking at the tallest building on the Fudan University campus, the Guanghua building. In my time there, Fudan University it amended its school charter and removed language referring to academic freedom, added a whole lot of language emphasizing the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party over the university and so forth. This provoked a bit of resistance. There were student protests over it, small sort of demonstrations in a cafeteria, for example. And yet on the whole, this was swallowed by the university community. And in general, the story from my visits to various universities and campuses across China were one where liberal faculty have been sidelined and often removed from their positions. Some of them have left China or left academia, and the party is really asserting its control over universities and over intellectuals more generally in more and more assertive ways. My last broad point has to do with control over information and ideas. And we see that here we see something about how Communist Party rule today makes tremendous use of information technology in all kinds of ways. Here we're looking at a intersection on the street in Ningbo, where I visited last fall. This is a police kiosk, and it has a digital display there where there's an unfortunate Mr. Han, who, as you can see from those images, was caught on camera crossing the street against the stoplight. He was digitally identified, and they're not naming his given name, but they know that it's Mr. Han who did this, and he's being publicly shamed for having done that. And you can see that how the state here doesn't shy away from flexing its muscles, emphasizing that it's using its control over information to make people follow the rules. And we see this in all kinds of ways in China. WeChat has been much in the news. So this is the master app that everyone has on their phones in China. It's sort of like it's an app, and yet it's almost like a mini operating system all on its own. Through WeChat, you communicate with other people, you participate in groups, WeChat sort of tries to encompass the entirety of the internet within it, so that you can, without leaving WeChat, you sort of read people's blogs and read the news and so forth. You can also pay for everything using WeChat. It connects to your banking accounts and so forth. It is incredibly convenient. It works quite well. I would prefer it over something like Facebook's messaging software, for example. We've seen it in the news just in the past few days in the United States, where the Trump administration has said it's going to ban WeChat on national security grounds. Just in the last 24 hours, that has been put on hold by a court in San Francisco because it's been challenged by WeChat users. If China is blocked in the United States, it's going to be a big problem for Chinese here. Everyone who communicates with anybody in China pretty much relies on this app now. So it will be a further sort of blow to US-China relations, in a way in which the two countries will really be further ripped apart on a human level. So I'm not personally in favor of this ban. We'll see where it goes. But there's no question that this app, which is run by a company called Tencent, it's led by one of those billionaires that I was talking about, Pony Ma, and it is deeply connected indeed with the Chinese Communist Party, and is very much complicit in its efforts to censor and the internet. So because so much communication and information is routed through this one app, it becomes all the more easy to control and filter that information. Several things to bear in mind about censorship in China. There's been a lot of research on censorship because, especially in the digital realm, it's so easily observed. So we're kind of seeing a flourishing of research on these topics. So news media and the arts in China are highly selective and slanted on topics of any political sensitivity. Many websites and services outside of China are blocked, and this has gotten worse under Xi Jinping. However, it's also true that not all negative comments, critical comments on social media or bad news is blocked. So if you look at that graph on the right here, this comes from an article that was published in 2013, showing how they tracked posts that people put up on social media about the dissident artist Ai Weiwei. And we see that, so the red ones are posts that were censored. A lot of ordinary posts are not censored about this dissident artist, although the censorship is dynamic. It responds to ongoing events. And when Ai Weiwei was suddenly thrust into the news, when he was arrested, then posts about him were much more likely to be censored. So the censorship is this ongoing. It's partly automated. It's also a very human process with armies of tens of thousands of people that are monitoring the news 24/7 and responding to it. And scholars like Professor Margaret Roberts of UC San Diego. She published a book a couple years ago called Censored, which I recommend to you, emphasized that China's approach to censorship is very sophisticated. It does not need to block everything. You can get around it if you really try, using VPN technology, for example, to access the outside world. All it has to do is make it easy to access state-approved information and to flood the internet as much as possible with pro-state messages, and hard to access dissenting information. But in thinking about information in China, we have to think not just about ways in which the party blocks information, but also the sort of the more affirmative messages that it puts out. This can take the form of a kind of a personality cult around Xi Jinping himself. I was really struck by this billboard that I saw in Shanghai last year, where he's presented here in the kind of iconography that we saw under Mao, where Mao was presented as sort of the rising sun, and so too Xi Jinping is presented that way. He's also often presented as a man of the people. Here we see him in a famous sort of encounter where he went to a very ordinary, humble steamed bun shop in Beijing and sat and ate among the people. The state media can be absolutely fulsome in its praise of Xi Jinping and in the way in which accounts of his activities on a day-to-day basis sort of consume much of the official media. Here we see a front page of the People's Daily, the Communist Party's official newspaper, in 2015, where some sort of record was set. Every single front page story was about Xi Jinping. It's not always quite that bad, but it is often like that. But in thinking about this, I want to take us back to one of those 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. Here's a man named Wang Huning. He was standing second from the left in the lineup that I showed you earlier. And he's interesting because he's not a typical sort of member of the leadership. He's a former professor and dean at Fudan University, the very university where I was based last year. And so I talked to people at Fudan who knew him. They're sort of proud of him. Their main disappointment is that despite having risen to the very highest ranks of the leadership, he's failed to sort of bring home the bacon. He hasn't brought home, major budget increases for Fudan University, at least not yet. But he's remarkable in a number of ways. He served not just an advisor to Xi Jinping, but also to Xi's 2 predecessors. He was, as we saw, elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee in 2017. This is extremely unusual for a professor, for an academic, and sometimes I like to refer to him as the world's most powerful living political theorist. So we don't really know too much about it. There have been studies, some articles published about him. We don't know too much about him. We don't know exactly what he's responsible for in the ideas and the messaging of the Xi administration, but surely he has a hand in much of what we see there. And what we see in the sort of today's propaganda is a range of things, and I want to just give you a quick taste of it. We see messages like this one on the occasion of the 70th anniversary: "Long live the great Communist Party of China." That's sort of bold, straightforward, not subtle at all. We also see messages like this one, and propaganda bulletin boards. They never went out of style in China. They've become, if anything, all the more ubiquitous, all the more really sophisticated too. So here we have: the people have conviction, the state has power, the nation has hope. Here we have one that connects to Xi Jinping's broad slogan of the China dream. We are all running as fast as we can. We are all pursuers of the dream. This is just across the street from Peking University in Beijing, China's sort of single most famous institution of higher education. And here we see sort of connecting people's individual lives and struggles and strivings with the broader goal of the glory of China. Here's a picture that I took down in Guangzhou going for a day hike on Guangzhou's famous mountain Baiyunshan, the path along the first sort of half mile of this is completely obscured by these massive bulletin boards espousing one of the ubiquitous slogans of the Communist Party, the 12 core values of socialism. And I won't go into all 12, but one thing that's distinctive about them is that we see that these values sort of embrace all that is good, all that is potentially valued, including things like democracy, and you can see there on the very far right, freedom. So the Chinese Communist Party states that it espouses these values that one might associate with democracy and liberalism. China says, no, those are things that we also incorporate on our own, but just in our own distinctive ways. So that gives you a sense of the kind of sophistication of propaganda efforts. You might imagine that sort of the inescapable and bombastic propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party would just lead people to revulsion, and yet I think that would be I think that wouldn't be, that conclusion wouldn't necessarily be warranted. I think that a lot of these very sophisticated messages have quite a bit of resonance among ordinary people. And when we look at, there's also been a large number of studies of public opinion in China. Needless to say, it's very hard to measure what people really think about the government in China, given, are people really able to say that they don't approve of the government or the party in response to public opinion surveys? So we have to take all these things with a big grain of salt. But when we see studies like this showing high levels of regime support in China, and there are many other studies like it, this comes from a book by Bruce Dixon that is also, I think, a good book to recommend to you as well if you're curious, from 2016. We see high levels of regime support. That is very much borne out, I think, by certainly the kinds of conversations that I've had with everyday people on the street in China in all kinds of contexts. So you might say that all these efforts to appeal to public opinion are quite effective, and all five of the factors that I've been discussing here are ways in which the Chinese Communist Party sort of builds support for itself, builds resilience. Okay, I'm almost done, and I think I've slightly exceeded my time, but I wanted to just touch on some recent hot topics and see a little bit how the things I've talked about apply to them. So as of not very long ago, as of February and March, as you recall, things looked really grim in China, especially in the city of Wuhan, that was where the coronavirus first spread to humans, that was hit so hard with the coronavirus. People were asking whether this would be China's version of the Chernobyl disaster, causing serious political harm to the Communist Party. But as of several months ago, China brought COVID more or less under control, and it used several measures: widespread testing, serious contact tracing, quarantines, mask mandates. And in part, the pandemic response involved mobilizing the neighborhood administrative apparatus that I studied in my dissertation research. So here we see a picture of neighborhood officials having sort of blocked off a neighborhood and controlling access to it, insisting that people get their temperature checked and so forth before they enter or leave. I also recommend to you, you might have seen 2 articles by Peter Hessler in the New Yorker about what it's been like to live in China through this response to the pandemic. He does an excellent job, as always, of documenting that, and the neighborhood dimension of this is very much brought out in those pieces. So now, as of September 2020, children are back in school in China. Those of us with kids in the United States sure find that pretty enviable. College students are going back to college. And in political terms, there's little question that bringing COVID under control is a public relations win for the Chinese Communist Party. Then when you add on how China now looks with fewer than 5,000 deaths compared to any number of other countries, whether we think of the US or the UK or France or others, China clearly sees this as a propaganda triumph, validating its argument that strong state power, unhindered by concerns about individual liberties, produces good public results. Of course, we also know that East Asia's democracies like Taiwan and South Korea have also done a good job in controlling COVID, even better than China, at least in the case of Taiwan. So you need a strong state to control a pandemic like this, but it doesn't have to be an authoritarian state. That's my personal spin on this, not China's. Briefly on Hong Kong, we've seen in 2014 the umbrella movement demanding that the chief executive be chosen through popular elections rather than by a special committee that Beijing controls. This was followed last year by extensive protests, sometimes violent protests, against a proposal to allow extradition into mainland China. And then just a couple of months ago, in late June of 2020, China introduced a national security law for Hong Kong that criminalizes a wide range of things that are seen as threats to national unity. It dramatically undercuts freedoms of speech and assembly that Hong Kongers have long enjoyed, and it has already led to arrests of protesters and a number of critics of the Hong Kong government, also raids on critical newspapers. So this is a real transformation of the politics of Hong Kong and the freedoms that people once enjoyed there. But finally, I want to also mention the internment and re-education camps in Xinjiang. So just in the past 3 years, starting in 2017, we've gradually learned more and more about a set of several dozen camps that China has built in Xinjiang. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim minorities, especially Uyghurs, have been taken to the camps, ostensibly for re-education. This is the Chinese state's response to a series of violent events, including riots in 2009 in Urumqi and a knife attack in 2014 in which 8 Uyghurs killed 31 people at the railway station in Kunming in South China. There are also other dimensions to China's program in Xinjiang as well. It's not just these camps. There's also a startling program of compulsory visits where more than 1 million Chinese civilians, most of them members of the Han ethnic majority, occupy the homes of the region's Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities and undertake programs of indoctrination and surveillance. They come and visit your home, presenting themselves as older brothers and sisters of their hosts, and take notes on you, and those notes could lead to you being sent to one of these camps if they don't like what they see. So among the things that make all this alarming is that Uyghurs and other minorities can be sent to the camps for a very broad range of reasons that seems to include any form of Islamic worship. And it's seen as an effort to forcibly assimilate the Uyghurs, to do away with the things that make them distinct as a people, including their own language. So let me just say that what we see in Xinjiang, as well as what we saw in Hong Kong, bears hallmarks of Xi Jinping, asserting the unity of the Chinese nation. The project of national rejuvenation and the China Dream is an effort to do away with pluralism and diversity in a really bold way. You would think that what China is doing in Xinjiang and Hong Kong could backfire. Surely it will create resentment and further resistance. Xi Jinping, though, has confidence that any backlash can be suppressed. And finally, China here in both Xinjiang and Hong Kong is taking forceful action without fear of international repercussions. It doesn't matter that the whole world is watching. Xi is not worried about what the United States or what the United Kingdom thinks, and expects that any reactions will ultimately not amount to much. He might be right about that. Okay, thank you very much for listening to this, and I'll be glad to discuss this further in response to your questions.